This is Taylor, Texas, and it might feel like we're in the middle of nowhere, but we're only about a half hour outside of one of America's biggest boom towns, Austin. Taylor only has about 17,000 people, and the downtown has shrunk in recent years. But that's about to change because of a huge investment.
Samsung has chosen Taylor, Texas as the site of its new state-of-the-art semiconductor chip fabrication plant.
Last fall, Samsung, the world's largest semiconductor maker, announced it would build a $17 billion chip fabrication plant, or fab, in Taylor, creating more than 2,000 jobs. And Samsung isn't alone. Intel, Texas Instruments, and TSMC are also returning their chip manufacturing to the US. These companies were lured by new state and local subsidies, and they could soon receive even more money from the federal government.
To be able to say, made in Ohio, made in America, is what we used to always be able to say 25, 30 years ago. That's what this is about.
America has long been losing ground in the race to make chips. That's fueling bipartisan concerns about our reliance on those made abroad. And that's a problem, because semiconductors are basically the foundation of modern life. They're in your car, they're in your phone, your laptop, and even your washing machine. But thanks to the pandemic, chips have become harder to find. The pandemic led to a spike in global semiconductor sales. And that led to product delays for consumers and highlighted a growing problem. America isn't anywhere near making as many chips as it needs. I sat down with Samsung executive John Taylor at the company's Austin campus.
How big is that plant going to be?
You know, we've got 1,200 acres in Taylor, so we're going to construct 6 million square feet of buildings. The capacity that we're going to bring online in Taylor is really going to help us give a lot of opportunity to our customers and also help us to contribute to the stability of the semiconductor supply chain problem.
To woo Samsung, local and state governments offered a slew of financial incentives. The city of Taylor and Williamson County offered 90% property tax breaks for the first 10 years. The state of Texas threw in $27 million of its own. In return, Samsung offered to make donations to local schools and guaranteed career help for Taylor students. But some have questioned if subsidies should even be necessary.
We are debating legislation to provide some $53 billion in corporate welfare with no strings attached to the highly profitable microchip industry.
Samsung is one of the world's most valuable companies. It's worth around $388 billion.
So we're a few miles from downtown Austin here. Downtown Austin is full of cranes, big tech companies coming that aren't getting subsidies. They're bringing jobs here and they're not asking for anything in return. Why do you need subsidies in order to build this plant in Taylor? If it's a great business opportunity, why not just build it?
I think the incentive packages certainly lure a lot of top companies here. It makes it a competitive advantage, not only country to country, but just within the states. Texas and Williamson County and the city aren't the only areas that are offering incentive packages. Certainly other places that we looked did the same. Everybody would like to be able to get these type of projects, again, in their area because they can see the economic development that will happen, and that's generational development too. This is not just short term, it's really a long-term investment.
Samsung recently broke ground on the Taylor site, and the company said its fab would be up and running by the end of 2024. James Lewis is a technology and public policy researcher at CSIS, a DC think tank.
The countries we have to worry about are China,
basically China.
What happens to the American economy or to the American consumers' ability to buy things if China decides that they don't want Taiwan shipping quite as many chips to the US?
If China were to decide to cut off supplies from Taiwan of semiconductors, it would cripple the global economy.
In 1990, the US and Europe produced more than 75% of the world's semiconductors. Now, they produce less than a quarter. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China are squeezing out the West. If those trends hold, by 2030, China will become the world's largest chip maker.
Are there any examples from history of America ramping up production of something like semiconductors and being able to displace some of those imports?
The idea that we would use a policy solution to increase production. It's not a new one. And it's industrial policy, which used to be a dirty word in Washington. Now you can say it. Railroads, airplanes, spacecraft, and semiconductors themselves. All these grew out of government investments.
America invented these chips, and federal research and development led to the creation of these chips. Taxpayer dollars. Over 30 years ago, America had about 40% of global production. But since that time, something happened. American manufacturing, the backbone of our economy, got hollowed out.
In the past, the US didn't have federal incentives for chip making. On the other hand, Asian countries typically offer cheap land to chip makers and subsidize manufacturing equipment.
That's one of the reasons that our share of chip manufacturing has declined. Everyone else subsidizes, we don't. The Chinese in particular have been willing to dump tens of billions of dollars into subsidies. And so everyone has figured out this is a strategic industry. Government can play a role by accelerating investment in it.
The Biden administration and Congress have set in motion legislation to provide funding to stimulate investment in the US. In June, the Senate approved $52 billion in direct subsidies for new semiconductor factories. The House has yet to take action.
Don't think of dollars, think of aircraft carriers. You want a fab, that's 2 or 3 aircraft carriers, right? We're talking huge investments to build these things.
And by comparing it to an aircraft carrier, you're comparing it to national defense. You're saying this can be as valuable for us as another aircraft carrier.
In fact, it's more valuable for us. Chips are more valuable for us than another aircraft carrier. It's the chips industry that is now underpinning the whole digital economy.
In March, the CEOs of major semiconductor companies testified at a Senate hearing about the chip shortage. They also encouraged lawmakers to pass the CHIPS Act.
In 1990, 80% of semiconductors were built in US and Europe. Today, 80% is in Asia, with only 12% in the US and half of that being Intel. Asian countries moved aggressively to attract this industry with strong incentive policies. Assuming we receive support from the CHIPS Act, the total investment from the site could grow to as much as $100 billion over the next decade. We have also thrown our factory doors open wide to provide capacity for US and global foundry companies. We seek to rebuild the entire supply chain on US soil.
One thing is for sure, the chip shortage is far from over. Last month, Intel chief Gelsinger said the shortage would extend into 2024 or beyond.